Today we are talking about resources on financing options for tribes and universities. And this has grown out of an in-person meeting that EPA Region 4 hosted here in Atlanta a couple weeks ago. It ran from September 8th to 10th, with September 9th and 10th really focusing on grant writing. And specifically on the 10th, we looked at universities and tribes together, potential partnerships, and both types of organizations were in the same room. So EPA has funded this effort as an outshoot of the in-person conference here a couple weeks ago, and we thank them for their support, and we hope that you benefit from some of the discussions that we had with everyone in the room from a couple weeks ago. Some of the objectives that we want to cover is to provide resources on grant funding. So tips on developing a grant application or proposal. We'd also like to highlight some of the opportunities and challenges for tribes and universities that are trying to work together. So we want to provide resources on grant writing for tribes and universities to work together or independently. Okay. We also want to highlight some of the university-specific components of grant applications. So universities have some unique hurdles to jump through when it comes to grant proposals and applications that we'll highlight today. And then last but not least, for sure, we want to suggest some other sources of funding for environmental projects that are more sustainable than grants. So those are our goals for today. First, I'll tell you a little bit, though, about the Environmental Finance Center where Lexi and I work. So this is a picture here of some of the staff from a couple years ago. You can see Lexi in the red sweater. We are based at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. We do have a satellite office in the Atlanta metro area, and that's where I work from. We try to address the how do you pay for it questions related to environmental projects. And we do that through a variety of ways. We do a lot of applied research. We do a lot of teaching and outreach. For example, this webinar today is an example of our teaching. And we do program design and evaluation. We work very closely with the local governments and other organizations to provide environmental programs and services in fair, effective, and financially sustainable ways. So that's a little bit about us. Now we have a couple poll questions that we will use to find out a little bit about the rest of the participants on our webinar today. So Lexi's going to bring those up, and she'll pull up the results right away as well. So the first poll question.
Our first poll question is, which type of organization do you work with? Do you work with a university, a tribe, or a different kind of organization?
Okay, and we'll give folks a couple seconds to respond to that.
Okay, it looks like most people have answered that.
Okay, we can see the results here. Most of the attendees or participants today are with universities, and then we have a good proportion from tribes as well, so that helps to give balance to the discussions on the webinar today. And then a few of you are from other organizations that cannot be classified as either university or tribe. So thanks for your responses there. We have a second poll question at this point that Lexi's going to pull up. And this one is, yes or no question. Have you written a grant proposal in the past? Okay, and so the results from that one say yes, 65% of you have worked on grant proposals in the past, but about a third of you have not. And that is pretty representative of the diversity that we saw in the registration process for this webinar. So we had everything from physics and biology professors to actual grant managers. So just based on your titles, we can tell that there was a broad spectrum of experience in terms of grant writing. So we'll try to cater to both ends of the spectrum today as we progress through the webinar. The next question, for question 3, is I have partnered on a grant-funded project with a tribe or university before. So seeing that the majority of you are either a tribe or university, have you partnered with the other type of entity in the past? Yes or no? Okay, and the results on that one are that some of you have participated on projects that involved tribes or universities, but the majority of you have not. So there is some room here to hopefully create some partnerships going forward. Okay, so we're going to start off with some resources on grants. A little bit of history on grants would be on the, oh, I should mention this upcoming event. There's an asset management training event that's occurring in Atlanta this week. When I checked with the folks last week that were organizing this training, there was still some room. So if you are in the area and you have a flexible schedule this week, I'm sure they'll be happy to have you join tomorrow and Thursday. This is an asset management training specifically for small drinking water and tribal water systems. So when we say small here, we're looking at 10,000 and below in terms of service population of these water systems. And that project is directly being funded by a bigger EPA project called Smart Management for Small Water Systems. With the Smart Management for Small Water Systems, our Environmental Finance Center that's based at UNC in the Southeast here is working with sister EFCs across the country, and we're providing a series of trainings for small drinking water systems specifically on not only asset management, but several other areas of technical assistance. We're also providing workshops on these different topics, so you can stay abreast of our training opportunities that may be in your area by checking out the website that we have listed there. Okay, so those were some announcements basically. We have another poll question at this point, so Lexi's going to bring that one up and we'll ask you guys to respond pretty quickly. If you manage a drinking water system that serves fewer than 10,000 people, are you interested in free technical assistance? Now I realize that that's not really the central focus of today's webinar, so I didn't give you that much information beyond that one slide. So if you feel like you're not sure, feel free to check the third option here and we will get back to you with some more information so you can see if this is something that you are interested in subscribing to. Okay, so jumping back in here to tribe and university partnerships specifically. So there are some, this is sort of a half of a SWOT analysis. We're looking at the opportunities or threats. So the advantages or benefits of these two types of entities working together, and then some of the potential issues or hurdles that they may have to overcome. So in terms of opportunities, universities tend to have students that are eager. The students cost a lot more after they've graduated, so there are savings costs that are inherent in them still being students. At the same time, while you have this eagerness and youth and energy that you can tap into at universities, you also have faculty that have varied and extensive experience. So they may have worked in different media, or they have worked with different communities across the country, so they can bring a lot of experience and background to a particular community or environmental problem. And so that is a nice mixture of expertise and labor hours that universities can provide. Tribal officials also they tend to have very deep local knowledge of their community. So that's something that a university professor that's probably worked a couple projects, well, a university professor who's probably worked a couple years at different projects all across the country, and a student who's kind of new into the environmental field, they may not have the deep local knowledge that tribal folks have. And so it's a really good combination of experience and resources here. Some of the threats to be aware of, and just kind of conversations to have early in the process and hash out, would be that universities are usually very interested in publishing data that they collect during a project. But they should be aware that tribes may have restrictions on what they want to publish, or what they choose to publish. So professors should have this conversation about publication of results before they submit an abstract to a conference or a journal, for example, saying that they will present the data from a particular project where they've worked with the tribe. Go ahead and outline these things and be clear about what's publishable or not ahead of time. And then deciding on the prime versus the sub-award entity can often be tricky as well. Universities tend to have higher overhead rates, which make the case for the tribe to be the prime and the university to be the subcontractor. But tribes have different approaches to this. So again, have this conversation early in the discussions, in the process, and kind of move forward based on your common understandings around these areas. As I mentioned earlier, this series, you'll see the next slide is going to look very different in terms of the background of the slide on purpose. So if we pull up the next slide here, we'll see sort of a different template or background. And that's because this slide was provided by Brandon Stevens with the United South and Eastern Tribes. As I mentioned, there was an in-person workshop a couple weeks ago at Region 4, EPA's office in Region 4, and Brandon provided some of the grant writing materials as well. He was very happy to share that material on the webinar today, so a couple of these slides were provided by him directly. So one of the things we talked about sort of queuing up for developing a grant proposal was history on grants and the type of grantors. So you have everything from government, which would be at different levels, federal, state, and local government. You have corporate, private foundations, and even individuals that provide grants. The types of grants vary as well. There are grants to individuals for their own personal development or professional development, and then there are program-based grants. There are other grants, especially from foundations, that will support the actual capacity of, let's say, a nonprofit organization. So they'll pay overhead type costs. They'll pay to keep the lights on and keep the doors open. So there's a lot of variety out there in terms of types of grantors and the types of grants that they do provide. In terms of what resources you need, on the next slide, there are a list of things that you probably want to pull together if they are, or check to see if they are mentioned in the RFP or the request for proposals on a certain grant. So one is the indirect cost agreement, which we'll talk, we'll spend some more time on that particular one during the rest of the webinar. You want to start collecting letters of support and commitment of resources, etc. earlier on in the process, so that you give those folks a week or two to get those back to you while you're working on the actual writing of the proposal, for instance. So this is a good checklist that you might want to develop to make sure you have everything lined up when you're putting your proposal together. The next slide lists some specific federal government requirements in terms of grant applications. So any federal government grant is going to involve an SF-424 form and a budget form that's also called SF-424. And here, the EPA, for instance, or any federal entity wants a specific format for the budget. The line items are standard. This may or may not match the budget format that would work internally for your tribe or your university. In most cases, you have something more detailed in-house. And so I would recommend developing a system where just to save you time in transferring from one budget format to the other, so from the internal to the SF424 budget form, that you develop a template in Excel where maybe you have 3 line items that roll up into supplies, for instance, on EPA's or the federal form, the 424, so that this is automatic and you don't have to sit down there and calculate and add these up every time. The budget justification is also something that's really crucial with federal funds. They want you to give an explanation of the different line items on your budget. So, for instance, if you have a faculty member on there, they want his or her salary and a calculation showing that 20% of that person's time for this year is going to be spent on this project, for instance. So the budget is, this list here starts off talking about budget forms, and then it also ends with budget forms. In between, most grant proposals involve a short abstract, and it's very important that you capture the essence of your whole proposal or your whole project in a paragraph or 2, and that's a skill in itself. You do need to show that there is a need or problem in the community that you're working in, and then the rest of your proposal tries to address that or solve that problem. You are asked usually to demonstrate that your organization or your center or your tribe has the capacity to manage the level of grant that you're applying for. If this is the largest grant that you've ever received, you have to make a good case for why you'll be able to handle it, essentially. One way that a lot of federal grants ask you to demonstrate your capacity is probably talking about, they'll ask you to give examples of past federal grants that you may have, and you want to pick the ones that sort of match the level of the one that you're currently applying for. Evaluation is very important. Funders, whether it be the federal government, state or local or foundation, they have their goals, they have missions, their particular reasons why they are dispersing these funds, and you need to have some sort of an evaluation process built into your project or program where you will capture results, outcomes, outputs related to the work that you're doing, and you need to be able to report those results to the funder. Okay, we can move to the next slide now. In terms of private and corporate foundations, the often heard term there is LOI, or letter of interest, letter of project interest or intent, where you're letting this foundation know about your organization and that you would like to apply for funds in a certain amount. You obviously have to write a narrative explaining what you're going to be doing, your proposed project. You can review previously funded projects as well. And corporations may have phased application processes. So that's sort of one of the distinguishing factors between a foundation versus typical federal granting programs, where first you do the letter of interest, and then you may or may not include a budget with that letter of interest depending on the foundation's requirements. But later on, they do ask for more detail. They definitely ask for budget numbers at some point. Then there may be interviews and negotiations. So that's a little bit of a different flavor for the process as compared to federal grant opportunities. I wanted to provide Brandon's information. Again, he is with UCET, and you can contact him here. He specializes, of course, with working with tribes. Okay, so we'll leave his contact information up here for a second. And then I'm going to continue talking generally about grant writing tips. So one of the things that you want to remember or keep in the back of your mind as you develop your proposal is that you want to focus on the results from this particular funding source and not the work of your whole program or your whole organization. So there is limited real estate. You have a certain page limit or word limit for your grant proposal, and you want to maximize by giving a little bit of information about your organization and your capacity, but the bulk of the text should really focus on what you will be doing with these particular funds. It's not a good idea to mention unfunded mandates, especially if you're applying for federal funds. That probably doesn't go over very well with the selection committee that are federal employees that are reviewing your proposal. And then an important point too is if you're applying as a group, which I will stop to say is a good thing, funders are looking for a variety of reasons. They are looking for partnerships and they're looking for collaboration, leveraging, that kind of thing. Those are popular terms and concepts for funders right now. So having different partners team up to go after a grant is looked on usually favorably, but there are some things that you need to be aware of. You have to choose one entity as the lead agency in most cases, and so we call that this entity is going to be the prime. And you pick either the entity with the most work with that particular agency or funder, or the best relationship with the funder. But sometimes you have this idea of picking who's going to lead the proposal or be the prime is something that needs to be discussed and clear in the beginning. You don't want to leave any gray areas there. So continuing sort of with grant writing tips, you should know that for the folks who have not written a ton of grant applications in the past, most funders will allow a period for submitting questions about the request for proposals that they've issued. So they will say, please submit any questions where you want clarification by a certain date. And then they will post the responses to those questions, usually on a website somewhere. But just a word of caution here is to be aware that the questions that you ask may be published for other applicants to see. So keep that in the back of your mind when you submit the questions. Look over any sample grant applications. Not all funders do this, but when they do, it is really a useful tool for current grant applicants. So if you can find fictitious or actual old grant applications that were successful, that's a recipe for success right there. So you want to look over those if they're provided, and possibly even ask funders if such examples do exist somewhere for you to refer to. The other thing is to focus on your community's unique needs and assets. We'll talk more about how competitive the grant world is becoming. That's not going to change anytime soon, and so to really make your project stand out, one of the ways that has been most successful is to really show the unique needs, the special things about your specific community or tribe or the university skills that your particular institution have developed because of the types of projects that you've done in the past, for instance. But trying to make it unique is really important. Then you want to distinguish clearly between outputs and outcomes. And if you're not funded, you want to ask the funder why. That's a perfectly legitimate thing to do, and funders are used to it, so they would have their protocol. In some cases, they will set up a time and you can have a conference call with them and they will debrief on your application. They'll tell you what you did well, and they'll tell you also the areas that you can improve. This is really important because a lot of grant funds are dispersed in annual cycles. So if you applied in 2014 and you were not successful, getting some feedback from the selection committee or the program that issued the grant would really help you to improve on your proposal for 2015. Or they may explain to you that for some reasons you were not really eligible or you're not a good fit for what they're looking for, and maybe you do not waste the time and resources to apply in 2015. But you are within your rights to ask why you weren't funded, and the information can be really valuable. On the next slide, we show a tool that we have up on the EFC website. And I will reiterate this later, but you don't need to type in that long URL. We recommend just going to our main website, efc.sog.unc.edu, and typing in a few keywords in the search area of our website to help you pull up tools like this. And you'll also you might go looking for this annotated grants application, but you may find other related tools that will help you, or publications or web pages. So don't worry about trying to write down that long URL. We'll send you also a copy of these slides afterwards in PDF format, and so you can click on it directly. But this particular resource that we have, this happens to be a grant application for wetlands, a wetland project. And we've kind of gone through it as a reviewer, and we've highlighted certain aspects that might be useful to somebody preparing a grant like this. For example, we look at the requested amount here, and it's highlighted that the clarity of the financial requirements is important, and the audience can figure out exactly what is being requested when you have such clear information. So this is just a screenshot of the first page, or part of the first page, but throughout the document we have feedback, if you will, or comments like this that sort of gives some insight into what the funder may be looking for. So that's one tool or resource. The next thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of grant funding is never to burn your bridge with a funder. And this doesn't have to be a direct confrontation or conflict with the funder during the project. It could just be simple things that you may not do that a funder expects that would have left a bad taste in the funder's mouth, if you will, about funding you in the future. If you are funded, be sure to report your results thoroughly and in a timely manner. Okay, so a lot of times it's difficult to put aside the time to actually report results, but it's very important to the funder because they have not been able to make it to all of your workshops. So they have not been in your science lab looking at how many times you've run that experiment. All they have to go on really are the results that you provide to them. So try to be disciplined in investing enough time and effort into the reporting of the results, and definitely meet the deadlines that the funder has given you for those reports. Give the funder recognition where possible. So most of us have publications and reports that come out at the end of our project, or even along the way during our projects. Include credit to the funders, include their logo in those kinds of publications, and you do have to get permission from an organization to use its logo, but that's probably a question that they will be happy to have been asked, and they'll be happy to provide their logo, and it also alerts them to the fact that you are giving them credit for some of the outputs of the work that they're funding for you. Inviting the funder to relevant events. Not all of us have projects that have ribbon cutting type events, but where you do, it's great to invite the funder to be part of those. And you can it can take some creativity, but we might be able to find ribbon cutting type events from projects that at first it doesn't seem like, on the surface, it doesn't seem like it lends itself to that kind of event, but that sort of recognition is something that you want to be creative about, trying to create those opportunities. On the next slide, another resource that we share with you here is something that the Environmental Finance Center put together a couple years ago. This is a tool, it's Excel-based, and it is available off of our website. And we've talked about how you can access some of our tools, but we put together this Excel table. It serves as a reference guide for the available federal grants that can be used by different wetland programs. Users of the guide can get more information on each grant from the website listed, or by looking up the grant by its CDFA number, which is the Catalog of Federal Domestic Assistance website. So we'll just run through a couple screenshots here of this tool, but again, you can download it and play with it on your own. It's Excel-based, and you can even, save it to your computer. The next shot here shows how you can click on certain parts of the tool, and you'd see additional information, for example, in this case on water quality. It also, there are different tabs. The first one, of course, is a list of instructions on how to use the tool. There are other tabs called Explore, Find, the summary sheet, and then we, of course, have to list the agency abbreviations with all the different acronyms that are involved there to explain that to the user. Again, the next slide shows how to find this tool on our website. So that kind of reiterates what I said before. Go to the main website and type in this case, something like Funding Guide for Wetlands, and that should help you to find the tool. And it may even bring up a couple other publications or articles that may be relevant here too that you might want to check out. All right, at this point, we're going to move into some university-specific components of grant applications, but I did want to take the opportunity to remind folks that if you have questions, you don't have to wait until the end when we have the sort of formal, if you will, Q&A session. Go ahead and type those questions in, and Lexi is queuing them up, and we'll address them later on in the webinar. Okay, so jumping back in here, universities have a key role to play in environmental work, of course. We can fund student work through our grants, thus getting quote-unquote cheap labor, as well as giving students at the same time valuable experience that they will take into their jobs, into the workforce. But there are some special hurdles that universities have to sort of work with, and so we're going to talk about some of them now. The first one is this concept of an Office of Sponsored Research or sponsored program. So the name of this office varies depending on the university that you're dealing with. But the role basically is consistent. So this program or office usually approves the materials, especially the budget involved with a grant proposal. Now, I wanted to highlight the budget here because, yes, the staff in these different offices do read through the technical proposal, but obviously they are not experts on the technical components of it. So they do things like checking to make sure that if you mentioned that you would do 3 workshops, that maybe something about workshops is mentioned or covered in the budget, for instance. Maybe a better example is if you say that you'll be taking a trip to go present at this annual conference that's going to be in Maine, they want you to look at possible prices for airline tickets. So that's the kind of checking they do, sort of comparing the technical proposal and the budget. But really, what's consistent about all the projects they look at, all the proposals of the budget. So they want to make sure that you have the right overhead rate, you have the right salaries in there for staff, and that kind of thing. So that's really where they spend a lot of the time on, usually. This office also monitors for conflicts of interest or potential conflicts of interest. So if a researcher or a faculty member is applying to a funder where he or she may have a spouse working there, that may or may not be a conflict of interest, but usually they have some way of checking for potential conflicts of interest. So they'll send you a survey as a researcher. You have to answer certain questions, and they'll contact you if they see any potential issues. Another important role that this office plays is that they are the authorized signatory for the university. And so faculty members, researchers, certainly students do not sign contracts and grant awards. That all has to be done by designated officials within an office at a university such as this. This group also reviews subcontractor budgets and scopes of work. So if we have a tribe working with the university, the tribe should just know how this works, in that they may be asked to submit a budget and a scope of work 2 weeks sometimes at least before the actual grant deadline, because all of this needs to be reviewed by this particular group on campus. So the bottom line here probably is that it takes time to work through all of these steps. at universities. So make sure that you factor that into your planning for your proposal. The next slide talks about what we call IRB approval or institutional review boards. So universities have these entities that review the proposed research protocol. And the goal here is to minimize risk to subjects as much as possible. They want to make sure that the risk to subjects, and in this case human subjects, are reasonable in relation to the anticipated benefits. They want to look at things like informed consent. Do you have informed consent in your protocol, and is it adequate? Where appropriate, the research plan makes provisions for the safety of the subjects during the data collection process. Those are the kinds of things that they look for with your research protocol. And again, probably the bottom line take-home message here is that it takes time to work through that approval process. Another thing that's unique to universities is the indirect rate. So sometimes it's not very easy to figure out exactly what that indirect rate is. Universities and the federal government, when we're talking about federal grants, have an indirect rate agreement. And you need to be aware of that number. When it comes to foundations, and we'll talk a little bit more about foundations later on, some of them have a limit on indirect rates as well. So for example, one foundation has on their website, so you look for this kind of thing. If you're going after foundation funding, you look to see if they'll limit indirect rate. They may have a statement on their website, for instance, that says that so-and-so foundation will not fund any overhead or indirect rates that exceed 15%, for instance. And so you know to accommodate that in your budget. And that also helps when you take it to the Office of Sponsored Research or sponsored programs, that they know that, well, the funder in this case is setting the overhead rate. We'd like it to be 17%, but they say 15%, so that's what we have to work with. Universities can also have different rates for on-campus versus off-campus activities, for instance. And this is not the only distinguishing factor being based off-campus or on-campus. There are other factors that they consider that may influence the indirect rate. So I think one piece of advice would be, while you spend a few weeks working on your proposal and collecting your letters of support and that kind of thing, probably proceed that with contacting someone over at the Office of Sponsored Research and asking them what the correct indirect rate or the relevant indirect rate would be for the project that you're working on. And they'll provide that to you, and so you can kind of plan how much you can do with the rest of the budget, in other words. These rates make a big difference, so we wanted to spend some time on indirect rates because they influence the total budget quite a bit, and there can be a lot of diversity among those rates. So nailing that down early in the process, I mean, some projects, to be honest, the overhead rates may be, that the university insists upon, may be so large that it doesn't leave enough funds to do the specific project work. And so that's good to know if it's not feasible earlier on in the process. Okay, very good. Again, you can go ahead, we're kind of moving into another section here, but feel free to go ahead and submit your questions. We're queuing them up and we will take care of them closer to the end of the webinar. But you don't have to wait until then to submit them. So far we've talked mainly about federal grants. Now we will look at some other grant sources as well as some more sustainable funding sources. And for good measure, we have the money tree thrown in here. So if we look at non-federal grants, state government grants exist, as well as what we've mentioned before, foundations and charitable trusts and that kind of thing. They offer some grants as well. In all of these cases, making the case again for the cultural significance or the uniqueness of your community is really important. If there are environmental justice issues, that's something that you want to highlight. Again, the grant process is becoming only more competitive, and so you need to distinguish your proposal from the others that are coming in. So bring in these unique characteristics where relevant. A word about grants in general, whether federal, state, or foundation. Are grants really free money? The next slide, this slide shows that when you finish this webinar, maybe you'll have some emails to go through, and would you love for this to be one of them? Free grant money for you. And it says click here. And I assure you, if you click there, your IT support staff are not going to be very happy with you. It's not really, clicking on a link from an email like this is not a good way to find a grant. But as the next slide says, grants aren't completely free money. There are costs involved. So first of all, just applying for a grant can be time intensive, and it can be expensive in terms of both staff time and money. The applications can take months to process. So while the funder is trying to decide and score and all of that stuff, how does your organization or your tribe in the interim, how do you plan while you're waiting to hear back? Do you hire new staff or not? How do you make those kinds of decisions when so much is out of your control? You have to kind of wait to see where this is going to end up. Oftentimes, too, there are lots of strings attached to grants, so only very specific types of projects can be done, or there are multiple conditions. Detailed reports are required. And we're seeing more and more grants that require a percentage match as well. Percentage match is a very interesting concept. It shows that the applicant has a little bit of skin in the game. So they really want this project. They want this project done. They're willing to provide some of their own outside resources to make the project happen. They're not just applying for these funds because it's quote-unquote free money. So it's an interesting requirement from a funder's perspective, but it can be tricky for the applicant to find correct and adequate percentage match. So that's something else that grant seekers need to be aware of. There's lots of competition for grants these days, and we don't see that decreasing anytime soon. Grant money is just harder and harder to come by, and that makes all of the other points more important. So it sort of exacerbates the fact that applications can take months to process because the funders have more applications than they've had in the past. They can also afford to add more strings and conditions because so many different entities are competing for the grants. Percentage match may go up, again, because the competition is stiff. So, and then of course it increases the chance that your proposal will not get funded. So that is something to just be aware of, that grant money is not increasing in most cases and the competition is increasing. So that makes it increasingly difficult to secure grant funding. That said, we'll look at some other financing options at this point. So one is the fee-for-service. An example here could be providing water or air sampling. So you provide here, when we say fee-for-service, you provide a service to an entity that's willing to pay for it. This involves identifying a client up front. You obviously don't run out, collect a bunch of samples, and then try to sell the results or the samples to an entity. You look at the state or some other organization that may require sampling, and if it's something that fits into, let's say, your science students' curriculum and provides good practical experience for some of what they're doing in the lab or the classroom, then it's a potentially good fit. But you approach the entity beforehand and negotiate, especially on protocol when it comes to sampling. If we continue this example of air and water sampling that we're discussing here, you need to follow a certain protocol for the results to be matched with national databases and that kind of thing, or even state databases. So you want to establish the protocol and find the client beforehand. But that's something that universities and tribes can be looking at, sort of fee-for-service for the expertise and services that they can provide. Corporate funding is another option. Local businesses want something in return for their investment. So it's basically, in some ways, you can consider their funding as them buying green imaging for their businesses. They want to be seen as giving back to the communities in which they're located. So you have to be creative in terms of giving them this visibility. So if it's something like a new hiking trail that they helped fund, having signs up with their logos and that kind of thing provides that visibility and encourages them to donate to your organization or your projects in the future. User fees, different from fee for service. This is a charge of a fee to users of, let's say, a natural area. So maybe one of the projects that you got funded or the proposal relates to buying some land, doing some environmental rehabilitation, trying to increase wildlife on that particular area. Then it has potential for members of the public to actually value accessing this natural area enough that they're willing to pay a fee. And I would say that when you are actually applying in the proposal, this is something that came out of the discussions when the tribes and universities and EPA staff were in the same room a couple weeks ago. Go ahead in your proposal if you can and show a sustainability plan. So say this project is going to be funded by EPA, for instance, for 2 years, and you're going to do the land acquisition and the rehabilitation and wildlife enhancement in that time. Maybe in the second year, when your vegetation is established and that kind of thing, you want to start charging a fee to the users. And so that shows the funder that you have plans for keeping this area going and at least maintaining it going forward. And you probably don't have to spend too much of your page limit describing how the fee is going to work and how much it's going to be and exactly how many users you expect every day. That kind of stuff is going to work itself out over time, and it's not reasonable for the funder to expect very detailed explanations of those things, but some thought in that direction and some ideas on sustainability going forward are looked upon very well, is what some of the selection committee folks were telling us at that meeting at EPA a couple weeks ago. And then didn't want to leave out patenting a product. So the example here that's probably most famous is Gatorade. It's a University of Florida. It's from the University of Florida, hence the name Gator. An assistant coach had asked a team of university physicians to figure out why so many of the team's players were being affected by heat and heat-related illnesses, and the result eventually was Gatorade. And that university has since funded much research from the royalties associated with Gatorade. Now this is definitely an outlier example of patent success. I'm not saying that this is easy to do and let's all run out and create, you know, a new product like Gatorade, but it's a fun and inspiring model or fun and inspiring example nonetheless. So I thought I would mention it. But there are whole, at least at larger universities, there are whole departments or offices that will help you investigate if a product that you're working on has patent potential, and then once you've gotten past that stage, if they see that it has some potential, they can help you apply for the patent because ultimately it brings in more revenue to the utility. So you don't have to, in most cases, at least with larger universities, you don't have to do that patent process or take it on all by yourself. Something to consider. Okay, the other thing I wanted to mention in terms of financing options, I wanted to dedicate a whole slide to this particular option, which is Green Revolving Funds, or GRFs. A lot of universities are developing these. In some cases, they're seeded by students providing fees that go into these funds, and the funds revolve in that they're loans that are repaid. There are a variety of ways that they can be repaid. So we'll look here at this example of loans for energy efficiency upgrades. So if a department or building within the university wants to upgrade in terms of energy efficiency, one of the hurdles in the past to that kind of upgrade has been the expensive upfront costs. What the revolving fund allows to happen is for the funds to be provided at the beginning, the upgrades are done, and then we track the savings on utility bills going forward. Those savings go back to the fund, and so we've now created a sustainable pot of money for future projects. One of the potential pitfalls with this kind of energy upgrade at universities in particular and other large entities that have multiple departments or sections is that once the energy bills have gone down this year, maybe next year the parent organization or the head of the university is thinking, well, I can budget them for a smaller amount. But this is a good way to capture those savings and reinvest them into other sustainable projects. So we're not spending too much time on this webinar, on this particular concept today, but there are a couple resources I wanted to point out if you wanted more information about green revolving funds, especially for universities. There's an organization called the Sustainable Endowments Institute, and they have two things I'll mention: the $1 Billion Green Challenge for universities and nonprofits that are creating these green funds to enhance energy efficiency. They also have something called GRITS, which is the Green Revolving Investment Tracking System, and it's a tool that you could go to their website, get more information on, and start using at your organization. In terms of tribes and institutions, the same organization put out a report called Minority Serving Institutions Green Report in 2010, and they worked with the United Negro College Fund to publish the report, and it involved a survey of over 50 tribal colleges, Hispanic serving institutions, and historically black colleges and universities. It centered around sustainability practices at these different institutions. So that's something that some of the folks involved on today's webinar might be interested in checking out. On the next slide, we look at financing possibilities from utility partners. So utilities in the community may involve water, wastewater, or even stormwater utilities or electric utilities. Oftentimes, these utilities have certain goals to meet. They have objectives, and if the objectives of your project happen to align with the objectives of the utility, there may be opportunities to receive some of the direct revenue that the utility charges its customers and generates. For example, if you are dealing with a stormwater utility, there are close environmental project connections there. In fact, some stormwater utilities are designed because the community has to meet 6 major areas that are given by the federal government, and one of them is education to the customers. And so universities obviously are a good fit for education. So again, this doesn't happen overnight. You want to have a good relationship with the utility staff. You want to have a good understanding of their goals and objectives to see where it may align with yours. But it's something to pursue and work on over time. And then on-bill financing and special fees is another area that utilities can, that's one way that they can generate funds. And again, if your goals align with theirs, maybe universities and tribes can leverage some of that revenue that's generated. In-kind contributions such as meeting space. Utilities often have conference rooms, different types of meeting spaces, and so one way that they can provide resources to your project is by hosting these meetings without a charge or even a reduced charge. An in-kind contribution such as meeting space can be used as cost share on some grants too, so that's really important. We talked about grants and one of their pitfalls or potential pitfalls being having to produce percentage cost share or a match. And so in this case, no money has changed hands, but it might help you to come up with that 25% match that some grants may require. On the next slide, we look at financing options from local government partners. So potential ideas there. The city and county, of course, provides, or they have taxing power, and they generate revenue through taxes. And again, if your project meets the goals of the local government, there may be opportunities for you to get funding from the local government to pursue your project. In-kind contributions such as meeting space applies as well to local governments and can be used as cost share in some cases. And there are probably other, there definitely are other relevant examples here of how direct revenue or in-kind contributions can come from a local government partner to a university or tribe. And we are allowing you guys to submit some of your ideas, either things that you have seen others use or you've used yourself in the past in terms of working with local government partners. Go ahead and submit those in the chat box, and we'll call out some of the interesting ones that we got closer to the end of the webinar. On the next slide, we just give you a couple ways to kind of stay in the loop or stay up to date with what's going on. We have a blog at the Environmental Finance Center, and I'm going to let Lexi talk a little bit about the blog because she is sort of our blog keeper. She also does a good job of tweeting some of the activities that the EFC is involved with. So Lexi, do you want to mention a couple of things about the blog?
Sure, thanks Stacy. So our blog is, we write on different topics, including water finance, watershed finance, wetland finance, and it all has to do with our research and our findings and some lessons learned that we like to share with you. So we try to post new blog posts every week, and you can sign up to get updates when we've published a new blog post. And so in a few minutes we'll ask you if you want to be signed up to our blog. And just to let you know that if you do subscribe there, we won't use your email for anything else but to give you the update that a new article has been posted.
Great. Thanks, Lexi. And so I think at this point we will run a couple more poll questions, so I'll let Lexi pull those up. Okay, so we were wondering how many people are watching the webinar from your screen. How many people are in other words, in the room with you? Is it just you? Are there 2 to 5 people, 6 to 10 people, or 11 or more people? Great, and the final poll question? Would you like to subscribe to the EFC's blog? So we did have the URL on one of the earlier slides saying how you can sign yourself up. But if you want Lexi to go ahead and add your name to the blog list, you can just click yes here and we'll do that.
Okay, Stacy, I think we're ready to take questions.
Sounds good.
So our first question is, how much detail should you give when talking about the science behind your proposal or your project? Because the funder may not be an expert in that particular topic, and so is it better to err on simplicity or give more detail on the science?
That's a really insightful question. So I think I would start by saying that you probably cannot give as much detail in a proposal as you'd like to because of the page limit or the word limit. So right there we do have to reduce what we'd probably want to say, especially when it comes to the detailed technical scientific stuff that we're proposing. We had some interesting discussions about this particular issue when the tribes and the universities and past EPA selection committee members were in the same room a couple weeks ago in Atlanta. So you want to strike that balance, which is not easy, between giving enough information so that the reviewer knows that you have a deep understanding of the topic and the science, but you also don't want to exceed the word limit. We talked about things like the relationship between the 10-page proposal or the 10-page limit on a proposal and the appendix. And so you need to put a couple sentences in at least that describe that you're very familiar with the particular method you're talking about or the technology that you're talking about, because you can refer to the appendix. This was the general understanding that I got from the discussion. You can refer to an appendix, but that's only if the reviewer wants a little additional information. Technically, you're scored on those 10 pages in most cases, and you have to read the RFP carefully to see how they want to handle appendices, if they're even allowed. In some cases, the funders don't want an appendix. We also talked about, related to this question, when you provide URLs in the text of your proposal. And again, try to spend a couple sentences that are very artfully crafted that show or give some indication that you have a deep understanding of this, you've thought this out, and you're very familiar with the concepts, but you can't explain the whole thing or say, click on this web address here and it'll take you to a previous study that I did. Reviewers have different ways of assessing that kind of thing. They may or may not click on the link. They may have been given instructions that that's not part of the 10 pages. So you do want to strike a balance there between referring to past work or additional work or details and providing enough detail in the proposal narrative that you demonstrate that you're very familiar. So it's a tough balance to strike, no doubt, but a good question.
Thanks, Stacy. Our next question is from a tribal group, and they were wondering if you had any suggestions for where they might start if they're looking for funding for land acquisition.
Okay, well, I think the example that we used today on the webinar involved federal funding specifically for wetlands. And we do not at the EFC have specific tools for each different area. So we don't have a land acquisition tool that matches that wetland tool. That said, I would encourage that tribe and others that are interested in this question to go to the EFC website and probably put in a term such as land acquisition funding and see if anything comes up that's useful to you. But most of our tools do not focus on getting to access different funding sources, specifically on areas like land acquisitions. It's a little bit, there are a couple other resources that I'd suggest here. So one is just Googling online, going to the web and searching around to see what's new, or finding foundations that may have funds for that kind of thing. And then specifically based on your location, there are nonprofit centers. So there's one in Atlanta, for instance, where you can go in to the center and you'll be able to access through their computers databases on foundations and trusts and other charitable organizations. You put in some keywords, there are different databases, so it takes a little skill or training in how to use these effectively, but it will help you search for funders that may match your project needs. Some of these databases, my understanding is you can probably pay a fee and subscribe to them outside of that center's office, but if you do not want to mess with those fees or you want some training on how to use the different databases, these nonprofit centers can assist with that. So it depends on your location. You can check to see if you have something like that locally available.
Great, thanks. So our last question here is about the other financing options that you described. We're wondering if those other financing options can count towards a % match.
Sure. So some of the examples I provided were, I think, meeting space was one of them. And in many cases, if it's well documented and there's a particular value that can be ascribed to that meeting room for a certain length of time, then you can make the case to the funder. So this involves having a conversation beforehand with, let's say, the local government or the utility, asking permission to use the room, and probably getting from them or a similar meeting venue how much financial value that space is worth, and multiplying that by the number of hours you plan to be there, for instance. And so you have to demonstrate and document how it can be used. I think we also talked a little bit in terms of other financing options on services such as sampling, for instance. And you can have students doing sampling, you can have volunteers doing sampling, and just members or citizens getting out there in the environment and interacting with water testing or air testing is invaluable just because of the nature of the work that we do in the environment. And there are a lot of opportunities for those volunteer hours to be assessed a monetary value, and that can be a large part of cost share. But I would say that you need to work with the particular funder because in many cases they have a protocol for volunteers to be trained, how the samples should be collected, and then just how you assign a dollar value to different volunteer hours. Okay, sometimes it's detailed based on the level of expertise of the volunteer, for instance. So you want to be familiar with their protocol on volunteer hours if you want to be using that as a cost share. And Lexi, I think we had one other question here about on-bill financing.
Right,
So
yeah. Could you just describe on-bill financing a little bit more?
Sure, I think I brushed over that pretty quickly during the presentation. So on-bill financing is where the utility or some third party provides the upfront costs or funds for, let's say, an energy saving project. So as I mentioned, I think energy saving or energy efficiency projects tend to have, relatively speaking, high upfront cost. And so in this case, it's funded by the utility or a third party, and then the customer repays the loan via a special addition to their monthly bill. So it just comes on your monthly bill. You pay this additional amount to repay the loan that you had from the utility or this other entity. So that's basically the concept of on-bill financing. And then if your project has to do with energy efficiency, obviously you can find some similarities there and probably work with the utility with an on-bill financing concept. Then the idea of special fees was also mentioned during the webinar, I think. So that is different from an on-bill financing, at least pure on-bill financing. But some water utilities, for instance, have a special charge on their bills to their customers that may say something like environmental fee, for instance. These funds can sometimes be used for quote-unquote non-traditional utility projects. So, for example, in Raleigh, North Carolina, there's a watershed protection fee on each customer's bill. And so if your project has to do with water quality within the city of Raleigh, in this case, or within the utility that you're working with, if you are helping, your project can help to protect the source water of that drinking water utility, there might be some opportunities to leverage there. And so you can work with the utility on that. But that was a useful question as well. So thanks for bringing that up.
Okay, well, I think that's it for questions.
Good. Well, I wanted to, again, thank everyone for their time and engagement in the webinar and for posing the questions and sticking with us to this point. If you have specific questions or comments afterwards, Lexi's going to give you an opportunity here with a survey, but you can contact me directly. As I said, even though our center is based at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, I'm in an office in Georgia, and there's my phone number and email address if you need to reach me. And Lexi, do you want to have a final word here about the follow-up survey?
Sure, yes. You should be seeing the link to the survey in your GoToWebinar sidebar there. And if you take a few minutes to fill it out now, that would be wonderful. If you don't get a chance until later, we will be emailing that survey link to you along with the link to the slides. So again, we would really appreciate your feedback. And I think with that, we'll go ahead and wrap it up, and we hope you all have a great afternoon.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.